All right, welcome back. In this lecture, I'll be talking about the kind of the road to the 30 Years' War, taking us from the Counter Reformation, kind of the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, all the way through to 1648, which is the Treaty of Westphalia ending the 30 Years' War, and where we see the state playing, ascending to power over that of the church, really once and for all, as far as international affairs are concerned, or even for the kind of safety and well-being, really, of citizens of Europe. And it really kind of is the um, origin for our modern notions of national interest, which we'll get into. So this will be kind of another kind of two-part lecture, 25 minutes a piece or so. I think should cover it. So just as a background, as an overview, you'll remember that Europe was experiencing or had experienced a great deal of stress resulting primarily or most immediately from the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, not just in one country, but virtually across all countries in Western Europe. There were very tenuous and uneasy efforts to keep the peace, and virtually all of these ended in failure to one degree or another. In some cases, you're going to have war erupting between the competing empires of Europe. Um, and other places of Europe, you're going to have civil war break out, as we'll see, particularly with the Dutch War for Independence, and also in Britain as well. So there were these efforts, these precarious arrangements that were made to try and maintain some sort of balance of power, and maintain the balance of power which had existed for decades and centuries earlier. Well, these just were incapable of dealing with the needs of the time, essentially. Uh, they proved to be too rigid. They were unable to, as I just mentioned, respond or really adapt to the changing nature of what Europe was facing. And this required, really, um, monarchy, monarchical power to fill the void, leading to, again, the creation of modern nations as we would identify them today. To give a respectful nod to the efforts to try and maintain the peace. You have um, the Catholic Church beginning to undertake what's called the Counter Reformation. This is so that once the Lutheran Church had established itself, once the Protestant Reformation was something that was going to be sustained, it could not be, uh, you know, quashed, which is ideally what the Catholic Church would have liked. Um, Once that was no longer an option, the papacy was going to realize that there were internal reforms within the Catholic Church itself that would be necessary. The Council of Trent, which convened periodically on and off between 1545 and 1563, tried to address the nature and the extent of these reforms. This is where Catholic bishops gathered to discuss the series of changes that the church should adopt. This was done, again, not to appease the Protestants in any way, not in an effort to try and bring them back into the ranks of Catholicism, but more was motivated more by the need to instill a stricter sense of discipline within the clergy, and the lay people themselves that remained in the Catholic orbit. This meant a stricter adherence with regard to the clergy itself, a stricter adherence to the enforcement of celibacy. In many cases, that had lapsed over the centuries. Also, there was a need to um, educate the clergy more thoroughly, um, not really to enlighten as far as the varying and competing ideas, philosophies, and the kind of early investigations into science and such, but more to synthesize the church's message, to make sure that all the priests, Catholic priests, understood um, that they needed to, you know, interpret the Bible in uh, a very specific way. This was done to, of course, enforce a sense of conformity, and that everybody was spreading the same message in the same way. They also wanted to have bishops and archbishops govern from their diocese directly. There would be no longer be people, once you attained higher office within the church hierarchy, the church bureaucracy, there would be no more moving to Rome to live the high life, but instead these bishops and such would be um, required to reside in the domains and the parishes and such in which they were to govern in the interests of church affairs, really, around Europe. Again, this is done to enforce discipline, not only to make sure that the bishops were doing what they wanted to do, but also to make sure that the bishops would crack down on any future Martin Luthers, to keep the priesthood in line and in check. They saw that, an absence of that type of authority directly on the spot allowed, in some respects, in this particular interpretation, allowed Martin Luther and others to begin to, splinter away from the core faith of Catholicism. So these are really the lessons that the papacy is drawing from, the experiences that it endured under the Reformation. They succeeded at reforming the church somewhat, but there was no reconciliation with Protestants across the continent. And so this really kind of suggests or foretells really a sense of foreboding that is going to just continue to fester between Catholics and Protestants. Regional disruptions also played into this, making sure that the embers stayed warm, hot even between Catholics and Protestants. And one of the best places to see this was within the Holy Roman Empire itself. The split between primarily Lutherans and Catholics within the borders of the Holy Roman Empire meant that the emperor himself was clinging to power. And again, the Holy Roman Empire itself had the illusion of being a very centralized, organized state under an imperial figure. In this case, in the time that we're talking about here, it's under Charles V, who was, again, as you many of you correctly pointed out, was this child born of the Habsburgs and the royal line in Spain, uniting these crowns together, creating this expansive empire. That is true to a certain respect. Within the Holy Roman Empire, however, Charles, with his experience with Martin Luther, with his experience with having to deal with this sustained Reformation, Protestant Reformation, he is going to be left largely at the mercy of the German princes and the German principalities they oversaw, as far as effectively carrying out any type of decree that Charles V wanted to enforce. And he knew that that potential for enforcement was something that was not going to be carried out in certain principalities, especially those principalities that were followers of Martin Luther. So it really shows his ineffectiveness, his just impotence, really, as an imperial figure within the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor was allowed to retain his title, but it was really in name only, as more and more political decision making was made at the local levels of these small principalities. And I'm talking about principalities that, in some cases, at one point are going to number some 300 small provinces within the Holy Roman Empire itself. So it is carved up to an extensive degree. Nonetheless, we have the Peace of Augsburg being ratified in 1555, in which the Emperor Charles V, in this case, announced that he was going to remain Catholic, but he would recognize the legitimacy of the Lutheran Church. He would allow that faith, that Protestant faith, to continue within the borders of his Holy Roman Empire. He also agreed to secularize church lands within the principalities of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Why do that? Well, because the churches, if churches were located in principalities that were no longer predominantly Catholic, then those properties needed to be, there would still be religious properties, but there would be Protestant religious properties instead of Catholic. So Charles V is going to agree to allow the German princes to determine the religious loyalties and the religious possessions within the principalities that they governed over. Again, Charles V is at the mercy of these local provincial leaders, essentially. So it's these secular princes that are determining religious belief, as far as religious practice within the borders of their small provinces, their small states. And so you're going to see within the Holy Roman Empire primarily, and this is generally speaking, in the northern provinces, German princes tended to practice Protestant faith, that is Lutheranism. In the south, southern portions of the Holy Roman Empire, they would retain their Catholic loyalties. What's interesting about the Peace of Augsburg in particular is that it was very accommodating to Lutherans, but that was also a fatal flaw because it only recognized Lutherans as a legitimate Protestant faith. The peace did not recognize any of those subjects that were practicing Calvinist faith or principles, or were Anabaptists, or were any other type of Protestant group. England is also going to encounter its own degree of intolerance, religious intolerance, within the borders of its kingdom, isolated on the English Isles itself. This began very soon after King Henry VIII's death. Again, King Henry VIII, he had a son who would, upon Henry VIII's death, ascend to the throne. He became Edward VI. He was a very sickly child. He had a very, very frail constitution and ended up dying soon after becoming king. He was died at quite a young age. He did not have any heirs, direct heirs, to pass on the throne to, and so it's his sister, Mary the First, who is going to become the next head of state in England. She was the child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon when both were practicing Catholics, and as a result, Mary was raised Catholic, and she came to the throne in England as a Catholic sovereign. So now she is a Catholic head of state governing a predominantly Protestant country. She comes to the throne in 1553, and she governs for a very brief 5 years. Now, when she came to power, she wanted to stamp out Protestantism within England itself. She persecuted and killed Protestants, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Her reign, of course, was mercifully short, and she did not have any children of her own, and so the next in line to inherit the throne of England was her half-sister, Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth becomes Queen Elizabeth I. She reigned from 1558 to 1603, and she is remembered as one of the most capable and successful monarchs in all of English history. She was an expert politician. She took a very moderate course, understanding the potential conflict, the simmering conflict between the Catholic and Protestant populations within England itself. And so she was very careful to negotiate and kind of navigate these very kind of dangerous waters between these two religious groups. She adopted some of the reforms that the Protestants had called for, basically a toning down, we'll say, of ornamentation within the church itself. Elizabeth was a Protestant, and she wanted to make sure that she was following through on not only being the secular leader of England, but again also under the act of supremacy from her father. She acted as the spiritual head of state as well. So as head of the Anglican Church, so she wanted to make sure that she was staying true to that. Some of the reforms that she did decide to carry out, to enact, did not go far enough for some Protestants. Those included Puritans, who were essentially English Calvinists, who were very wanted a cleansing of the church of all ostentation, very simplistic or simple kind of view, and simple expression of faith within the church, to focus the lay people's attention on salvation itself. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church. They thought that wealth and decor was a corruptive influence, and some Puritans refused to associate with the Anglican Church because they didn't feel that it went far enough in achieving the purging, basically, any type of wealth or public displays of pomp and circumstance. For those Puritans that could not, accept, the extent of Elizabeth's reforms, a portion of them decided to leave the English island. And they first went to the Netherlands, where there was also kind of a Puritan community. When in the that it in itself was not tenable for various reasons. One, again, the extent of purity was not up to snuff for these Puritans within the ranks of the church, but also at the same time, um, there's a civil war going on within the Netherlands between Protestants and Catholics. So, for peace of mind and for peace, period, these Puritans decide to risk transatlantic travel across to the New World to establish their own ideal religious community. And these Puritans become the Pilgrims, making their way to um, what is today New England um, in the United States. And the first migration takes place during the 1620s. Back in England, Elizabeth was going to again try her best to meld to make the Anglican Church basically a composite of Catholic and Protestant leanings, or not necessarily belief, but also just basically um, display as far as what to practice, and essentially how to practice it in order to carry on the faith. She used also as a political instrument. She used her own eligibility as a an unmarried queen to her advantage and to great effect as well. Over the course of her long tenure as the Queen of England, she rebuffed the King Philip II's, King Philip of Spain, who proposed several times to win her hand in marriage, and again try and unite the crowns of England and Spain together, creating kind of this sprawling uh, monarchical kind of power across Europe. That would basically unite England, Spain, and by marriage Spain and the Netherlands, as well as having very close ties to affiliations, and having family in the Holy Roman Empire as well. Philip II is the son of Charles V. When Charles V died, the crown, the imperial title of Holy Roman Emperor, did not go to his son Philip. It went to Ferdinand, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Philip did retain his crown as the King of Spain. And he retained those ties of loyalty and alliance, very close alliance, with the Holy Roman Empire, and also his sovereignty over the Netherlands, even though that was a province that was in rebellion for much of his reign. As long as Elizabeth, however, remained single, remained unmarried, Philip remained patient. He knew that if she wasn't going to marry him, then she wouldn't necessarily run the risk of marrying anyone else, because that would threaten war between Spain and England over this, the perceived affront of his proposal. So Philip was reluctant to alienate Queen Elizabeth, but at the same time he knew that time was on his side, because she would never bear a legitimate heir to the throne as long as she remained, obviously, unmarried. And he was comforted by the fact that Elizabeth's half sister, who stood in line to inherit the throne should Elizabeth never have bear children, her half sister that stood to inherit the throne after her death was a Catholic. So if Elizabeth was not willing to accept his hand in marriage, then maybe his half sister would be when she ascended to the throne. That woman's name was Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. Um, she was Mary Queen of Scots was really quite impatient to make her way to the throne. She plotted against her half sister, with a modicum of secrecy that was easily found out. Once it was, Elizabeth had her half sister arrested and imprisoned. From her prison cell, Mary continued to try and organize lay plans for the overthrow of her sister, the Queen of England. When this was discovered, Elizabeth really had no recourse but to execute her own half sister, or order the execution of her half sister. Mary had, from her jail cell, penned a letter to Philip II, promising her hand in marriage once Elizabeth had been removed from power or died. So now you have a Protestant head of state, Elizabeth I, executing a Catholic subject, her own half sister. This upset not only King Philip, because his plans were laid to waste, but also it upset the Pope as well. And in 1588, Philip is going to send the bulk of his Spanish Armada from Spain up to England to begin the process of invading the English Isles. That's where we're going to pick it up in part 2, and then carry on with the road to the 30 Years' War. And it's what happened during the course of that 30 years, and also again the kind of the Treaty of Westphalia and its long-term consequences. So we'll pick it up in a few minutes.